Let's talk about defense. For decades, defense was the great unknown of baseball statistical analysis. Now, we always knew that it was important, but we didn't know how to measure it. Even Branch Rickey, in this famous article in Life magazine in 1954, was helpless to evaluate fielding. Rickey had a good beat on offense, as you can see in his early formula for measuring what he called team efficiency. When it came to defense, however, Rickey was much less sure of things. He came to the conclusion that fielding averages were worthless, the same conclusion that sabermetricians eventually came to decades later. And in the end, he concluded that it was simply helpless to try to measure fielding. So was he right? Was he wrong? Well, you can be the judge of that. So sabermetrics these days can certainly do a better job of measuring defense than they could in Branch Rickey's day. I mean, sabermetrics didn't exist back then. But the problem is that modern measurements don't really tell us anything about the history of the sport, which for many guys like me is what we're really interested in. For example, as many of you already know, because of the technology we now have available to us, we can track precisely how fielders perform. For instance, to calculate the outs above average for Blue Jays fielders in 2025, we can physically see where their starting positions were before each play. We can then compare that with their ending positions to come up with a good idea of their defensive skill. You can then break that down by defensive position. For example, maybe Toronto is better at second base, but not quite so good at shortstop. And if you break it down further, you can see that Toronto's shortstops have a difficult time moving to their right for whatever reason. Now, this is really cool stuff, but its usefulness is kind of limited when you realize that the stats only go back to 2016. So is that a major problem? Well, it kind of depends on what it is you want to do. If you're in love with the modern game and you just want to analyze that to death because you're like a college student, you're a geek about it, whatever, then yeah, it's perfectly fine. But if you really want to answer questions about things like, say, the 1949 Philadelphia Athletics, unfortunately, those new stats aren't going to do you any good. Now, there's something about the 1949 Philadelphia Athletics that should at least be somewhat interesting to you. You see, in 1949, the Athletics set the all-time Major League record with 217 double plays turned in a single season. This is a team record that still stands to this day. Of course, the raw number of double plays the Athletics turned that year didn't have much to do with their fielding percentage, which was a little bit below average. The Athletics did benefit from giving up a few more walks than average, giving them more chances to turn the double plays, but they were far from leading the league in bases on balls. Now, maybe they did well at turning the double play because of Eddie Joost, who Topps noted was a superb fielder back in the 1952 set. And maybe Pete Suter's fielding was really good and we just don't know it. Or maybe Diamond Mine Baseball is correct to give the Athletics infielders excellent ratings. Or maybe doing so will cause them to turn more than 217 double plays in a replay. It's kind of hard to tell without going through and trying it. Now, it would be really nice if we could go back in time and see exactly what these guys were doing, how far they were ranging, where they were lining up as fielders, and so on and so forth. It'd be nice to know, were they going well to their left or to their right, things like that. But the problem is we really can't do that. We don't have a time machine. In fact, there are a lot of baseball history puzzles that we could solve if we could only go back far enough and use some of these newfangled statistics. We know, for example, that Derek Jeter's range as a shortstop wasn't great. But that doesn't mean you can't find examples of him making great plays. I'm pretty sure he actually got the runner on this one, but it was called safe at first, which means he lost a potential assist on this chance. But then again, sometimes Jeter got the benefit of the doubt.
Second base umpire Paul Nauer right there. He can't really tell. He's blocked out by his own positioning, but he is in the correct position to make that call. You see the sweep tag by Jeter, misses him by 2 feet.
But everybody knows that Derek Jeter was not a great defensive shortstop, right? Well, I guess, but I would argue that the jury's still out, and I have seen people continue to argue this from both sides to this day. You see, about a year ago I planned on doing a video comparing Jeter and Ozzie Smith both on offense and on defense, but I backed away from it mostly because I knew how controversial my conclusions would be. Well, let me give you at least a little peek of what I found. Okay, here's Jeter's defensive totals for his entire career. As you can see, his range factor is consistently below the league average range factor for shortstops, both per 9 inning and per game. Now, range factor is pretty easy to understand. It's putouts plus assists divided by games played in its most basic form. So by running out behind third base to catch this pop-up, Jeter increases his range rating since he gets credit for the putout. Meanwhile, even though keeping the ball in the infield here helped his team, Jeter doesn't get any range credit for this play since he didn't actually make the play. Now you can see right here what the issue with range factor is, right? I mean, even if we factor in errors, we still are not going to be able to determine precisely how many balls this fielder should have gotten to compared to what he did in real life. We would need these more modern FX fielding statistics to make that sort of determination. Take this play for example. I guess the fact that Jeter got to this ball was helpful for his range rating. Is that play any more indicative of his ability than this pop-up that went right to him? Now this is a good play, and Jeter has to make it since A-Rod is covering third base. But when you've got somebody like A-Rod playing third, you simply don't get assists on balls like this, which can make Jeter's range rating look worse. So in other words, that range rating might not tell you everything. In fact, the more that you look into this, the more it's clear that playing next to somebody who is an exceptionally good fielder will mean that you will have less balls that you can handle. Your range rating will naturally go down. And nowhere is that more apparent than with Dante Bichette. In 1999, Dante Bichette played left field for the Colorado Rockies, and he was horrible. After going through about half a dozen games, I found quite a few examples of him simply not getting to balls like this. Now the problem was twofold. First of all, Bichette suffered from leg injuries and really had no mobility at all. He is the classic example of a player who really should have been a designated hitter, not an outfielder. And the second problem is that the Rockies never really had a great center fielder. So Baseball Reference gives Bichette like this hilariously bad rating as a fielder in 1999. I mean, it's bad to the point where everything he did positive offensively is wiped out by his fielding. But the funny thing is that when you look at Bichette in 2000, when he was still injured, he was playing for the Reds then, because he was playing next to Ken Griffey Jr. in center field, Bichette suddenly looks a lot better. It helps to have a really good player next to you. And Bichette felt more confident knowing that he had backup. His knee still hurt him, but it wasn't as ridiculous as it was in 1999. Now, this is kind of a long-winded way of me saying that team defense in baseball actually is a thing. And even though sabermetricians don't really like to hear this, the truth is that in the end, it doesn't really matter who makes the putout or who makes the assist. I mean, all the manager cares about, all the team cares about, all the pitcher cares about is that you got the out. So is this play Jeter's fault or A-Rod's fault, or does it even matter? And should Jeter be mad at Chuck Knobloch for making this play instead of him? Here's an example of a poor defensive play, but Jeter's the batter, not the fielder. And things become even more confusing when you start looking at Ozzie Smith, who everybody knows was actually a great defender. Now, the fact that the Wizard was even in a position to potentially make this play is amazing. But it's actually not hard to find plays where Ozzie Smith had a hard time ranging to his left. And every once in a while, he'd make a great play on a bad hop, but then throw it away. But that's not to say that Ozzie wasn't an incredible shortstop. He absolutely was.
He goes to Ozzie Smith, back to Cox, double play.
I mean, some of these plays are just simply superb.
Ball and chopped to her. He feeds Ozzie, who throws to Lindemann. The third double play.
And even when he couldn't make the play, Ozzie's range still helped out his defense considerably. Anyway, I could go on and on with these. You can see, though, that it's not as simple as people think it is, right? The problem with defense is that its history is not very well defined. It really wasn't until about a decade ago that we finally figured out what it is that we wanted to measure and how we were going to measure it. Unfortunately, this means that a lot of the older seasons are extremely difficult to deal with. And that really shows in our favorite baseball simulations. Well, as you probably already know if you watch this channel, National Pastime, the first baseball tabletop game, has no fielding system at all. Some player cards had more air numbers than other cards, but that was it. There was no way to separate good fielders from poor ones. J. Richard Seitz came up with a defensive system for APA, which included both pitching and fielding components. APA's original fielding system was chiefly team fielding. Over time, the system paid a bit more attention to individual player fielding abilities, though the team aspect was always there. And you know, that's the thing that's really always made APA unique. I mean, there are team components to fielding in other games as well, sure, but APA is still the game that puts the most emphasis on team fielding, more so than any other baseball sim. Now, that doesn't mean it's perfect, but at least it's there. If you look at the average old APA card, you'll realize right away that nothing distinguishes a player's ability to not make an error from the player's range as a fielder. For years, Strat-O-Matic was the same, including the advanced game. There was only one fielding rating to begin with. In the late 1970s, Strat finally added in a separate air rating so that Rodney Scott's ability to get to the ball was separate from his ability to make an error. And that's more or less the same system that Strat uses to this day. Replay Baseball also uses a combination of range and air ratings, so it's a little bit simpler than Strat's system. But then there's another component of fielding that can be really hard to put your finger on. That's the actual positioning of players. In this case, for example, Bichette is playing shallow for some strange reason, which leads to this ball being a triple.
Here comes Guerrero to score. Shane Andrews being waved home. There goes Manny Martinez to third. The throw is not.
And from the very same game, this ball winds up being a double, again because Bichette was playing way too shallow.
Get there. All the way to the wall. Cabrera scores. Guerrero being waved home. He's going to score.
The truth is that good positioning is more important for defense than reflexes. If you know where the ball is going, you can make a hard play look easy. So Tommy Agee's catch in deep left center field here is incredible, sure. But part of the reason the play was so incredible is because he was shading Hendricks to pull to right center. That's more obvious in this fly ball from Paul Blair. Agee was also playing him to pull. These are incredible catches, yes, but they look even more spectacular than they really were because of where the players were positioned. And you know, this is where Branch Rickey really was right. Evaluating fielding really does become an impossible task. It's because there are just too many places where the guy could stand. Now that's important, but there's really no way to recreate it unless you bother to, collect that data to begin with. And recreating this aspect of baseball, therefore, becomes an impossible task. APA doesn't really give you many fielding options other than playing the infield in with a runner on third base. Strat-O-Matic lets you play the infield deep or in, or bring in the corners. You can also bring the outfield in, but you can't really do much about carefully positioning the players. Replay Baseball has very similar positioning options. And Diamond Mine Baseball lets you guard the lines, play the infielders in at the corners, or bring the entire infield in. OOTP gives you some additional fielder positioning options, though I've really never noticed that much of a difference between them. So in other words, it's really hard to figure out what to do about this aspect of fielding, the positioning, even if you've got the data in front of you. A lot of the adjustments are extremely difficult to capture in a baseball sim or even in a baseball video game. But speaking of baseball video games, there are reasons to care about how defense is characterized in those as well. Because I really haven't spent much time with them, I'm not going to comment on fielding in games like MLB The Show. The same goes for the Super Mega Baseball series. I want to give those games a good playthrough before I comment too much on them. However, there is a reason why so many of us feel that games like Bad News Baseball has the ideal fielding setup. The fielding view is zoomed out far enough to give you a good idea of where your fielders are. The camera travels to the fielder first before the ball gets there. And of course, your fielders can actually throw the ball, which is pretty important for a good experience. Now, those things are pretty basic, but it becomes obvious when at least these older baseball games are missing these basic features. And this is my #1 complaint about a lot of the older baseball games. The pitching and the hitting end up being fine, but the fielding is just ruined. In LJN's Major League Baseball, the camera is always behind the ball, and of course the ball winds up dying in the middle of the outfield. Plus, the fielder throwing speeds are insane. However, LJN's Roger Clemens Baseball is even worse. The fielding perspective here is simply impossible, and it's extremely buggy. I Love Softball, however, might be the worst since these girls just can't throw the ball. Because the camera travels so slowly, anything hit to the outfield is frustrating no matter what. But at least a lot of those games are zoomed out, well, except for Roger Clemens Baseball, which I don't know what LJN was thinking, whatever. In a sense, it's even worse when the fielding is zoomed way in. Bases Loaded 4, for example, takes the worst part of the Roger Clemens perspective and combines it with a zoomed-in camera to make fielding really hard. I know I've got this radar screen, but it's hard to tell where the ball actually is going to land. And Bases Loaded 3 is even worse since there's no radar screen to help you. I don't know why, but Jaleco's decision to do this makes games like these simply unplayable. In fact, that real zoomed-in perspective was a trend in the mid-1990s, which really is unfortunate. There is a radar system, but I found that it's not helpful at all. I really wish things were zoomed out so I could actually see what's happening. That extremely zoomed in perspective also hurts the old Ken Griffey Jr. game. Now, some of you will be mad at me for saying this, but the fielding in this game is really bad. There's simply no reason for everything to be zoomed in so much. Anyway, I could go on and on with this, but the point is that fielding is still really, really important, even in older baseball video games. The games that have better fielding, Bad News Baseball, RBI Baseball, even games like Baseball Stars that are a little bit more zoomed in than I like, those games tend to be a lot more fun because you can actually play them. The fielding actually works. Now, I'm not convinced that even our advanced metrics are going to help the baseball video games out, but the truth is that the player experience really suffers if fielding isn't right. And at the very least, it's nice when you have the option to, position your fielders like they do in real life. Anyway, it's amazing to me how little fielding is appreciated in baseball, especially considering how important it really is. One thing that is amazing about older games is when a good pitcher is taken out because his fielder screwed up and didn't make the play. And even the best metrics in the world cannot account for all the crazy things that can take place. Anyway, there you have it. Now, personally, I really like the new fielding metrics, but the sad thing is they don't tell us a whole lot about the history of the sport, which for people like me is really what we care about the most. It's hard to know the best way to account for fielding from the perspective of a replayer, especially if you're interested in the older seasons. Anyway, let me know what you think about all of this down below in the comments, and especially if you have any ideas of solving some of these more difficult problems.